How were armoured knights and other soldiers killed in the medieval period? Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria. Now on my channel I talk a lot about armour, I talk a lot about the medieval period, and one of the things I've noticed over the years is when I'm talking about things like this helmet, this is a 15th century English, Flemish style sallet, or indeed things like this, there we go, brigandine of plates here, and various other armours that I own full plate harness, which some of you guys will have seen. When I talk about these armours, one of the things that often happens is people point out the gaps in the armour, the openings. They say, why would anyone wear an open face helmet, which is specifically a topic I've looked at a lot in previous videos, but equally they point out other gaps. They might say your neck's exposed or the back of your legs are exposed and things like this. But this kind of pertains to one of the things I've noticed a lot when reading people's discussions or watching videos talking about medieval armour, and that is a lot of the time people have a perception that armoured people in the medieval period were completely 100% armoured, therefore to some degree impervious, and that you were either armoured or unarmoured. Now obviously this is an oversimplification. An armoured person is going to have openings, is going to have gaps for all sorts of practical reasons, because they've got to do a certain type of task, because they want to be able to give commands easily, because they want to see more easily, because they might need the manipulation of their hands. Certain types of gauntlets give greater mobility but less protection, or indeed because they need to ride a horse or various other things. So clearly there are compromises, and this is armour's all about compromise. You always, when you take on a level of protection, you give up certain other things, whether it's sight or breathing, being hot, mobility, things like this, weight, stamina, so on and so forth. Now, and equally there are different types of soldiers, and not all types of soldiers wear full plate harness, and indeed very often knights didn't wear full plate harness. So what we're going to look at here are some examples from medieval art, and I'm going to rattle through them. I'm going to try and keep this as concise as possible. We're going to look at some examples of medieval art where we can either see openings in the protection that is demonstrably being worn in the medieval period. For the most part, we're going to look mostly at the 15th century, or indeed we're in some cases going to see people actually wearing armour being killed, and we can say how were they killed. I just scribbled down a few ideas before we go into that, just to point out that people in armour can be killed in other ways as well, not just in combat. And you know, there's some obvious ways that people died on medieval campaigns, sometimes whilst wearing armour and where their armour didn't protect them. An obvious example is disease. Another one is suffocation. I'll come back to that one. Another one is heat exhaustion, and related to that, dehydration. And another one is falling or having things dropped on you. So clearly if part of a wall dropped on you, your armour may possibly save your life. Certainly builder's helmets still today can protect your head, but overall there are some things that where you might fall down something or have something fall on you where your armour's not going to save your life a lot of the time. On suffocation, now suffocation is a particularly interesting one, and that's something where certain famous people, even people related to kings you might be able to think of, Henry V maybe, suffocated in combat. So they didn't actually die as a result of wounds given by an opponent, but they were wearing armour, they were in a melee, and they suffocated. And clearly armour sometimes can make that worse because you might not be able to extricate yourself. So the simple fact is that armour can't protect you against all things all the time, even if it's designed to protect very well against certain types of weapons most of the time. It's never a full defense, okay? So there's always ways that a person in armour can be killed, obviously. But the other thing I want to address very quickly before we go into the actual examples from art is that armour does restrict your movement. So we see both sides of exaggeration of people's imagined effects of wearing armour. One is that it is very, very cumbersome and very, very heavy. That's not really true. The fact is that when you've got armour distributed all over your body, if it's correctly made and it's made to fit you and you're wearing the right arming garments underneath, then you can still be pretty mobile, you can still do a lot of things in armour, you can still move pretty quickly and fight for a fair amount of time, stuff like this. So that's on one hand. But we don't want to pull too far in that direction and forget the fact that yes, indeed, armour does come at certain costs. It does increase your mass. For example, it increases the amount of weight individually on your arms or your legs. obviously overall your total mass. So yes, it has an effect on the speed which you can move and how long you can move. It affects your stamina, it affects your heat, it affects your breathing, and all of these sorts of things. So yes, it does have negative effects, but no, the Victorian idea of a medieval knight being knocked over and not being able to get up again, that's rubbish. So the truth, as often is the case, lies somewhere in the middle. So let's get into these examples. The first example we're going to look at here is Swiss. It dates to between 1435 and 1450. Looking at the armour, yep, it seems to be basically Italian style armour, which was imported in Switzerland at this time. And so what we're looking at here is a collection of fully armoured figures. Interesting side note, note that the main figure with the crown is in red armour. Don't know how to interpret that, and the other people are in bright or white polished armour. Armour could come in many different colours. It could be blued, it could be browned, it could be blacked, it could be painted, it could be gilded, all sorts of finishes like this. However, we do also know that armour was very often, probably most often, bright steel and polished to varying degrees, and the degree of polish would tell you something about the wealth of the owner. So these people appear to be fully encased in plate armour of the mid-15th century Italian armour. However, do they have openings? Yes, indeed they do. Okay, so the first opening that you're probably going to notice is the face. Okay, even the guy who's just wearing a hat, obviously he's the king, but normally he'd take the hat off and put a helmet on. But if we look at the helmeted figures behind him, you can see they've got their faces exposed. Yes, indeed they have visors. One of them has a bever, the other doesn't. The other has a mail standard, as it's called, or mail collar, essentially. Now, keeping the visor up was often done to enable greater breathing, sight, sound, everything else. So there's many advantages to having the visor up, and the simple fact is that throughout the medieval period, many people who either had visors decided to keep them up, and many people who could have had visors decided to not even have a visor on their helmet at all and just have an open face helmet, of which this here is an example, a replica. So some people in the 100 Years' War, Wars of the Roses, and the various wars in the Holy Roman Empire, Italy, Spain and elsewhere decided to use open faces, either open face helmets or keep their visors up. And indeed, you'll notice the bever, designed to protect the lower half of the face, sometimes they left that off. There's many advantages to that. The bever can kind of limit your movement, sometimes your breathing, depending how it's mounted, and also your vision downwards as well. And it's frankly a lot more comfortable to not wear a bever. When I'm doing reenactment type stuff, I often don't wear a bever for that reason. So face and throat, obvious first things to notice. Other thing that if we move down a bit is the armpit. So the armpits are usually filled with what are called voiders, or mail in the gusset, essentially, to protect from thrusts in the armpit. However, mail can be bypassed. It's not as sure a defense against something like an arrow or even a lance or a spear as plate armour is. If we move down, we now get to the groin. We get down to the crotch level. Now at the crotch, there's a number of things about the crotch that you need to know. One is that there isn't necessarily a direct opening to it, but you can come up underneath, and this is shown in a number of treaties. So there is obviously an opening, because that's where the legs come out at the bottom of the cuirass, and you can come up with thrusts under there. And what might they be wearing under there? Well, a lot of people didn't wear anything under there except for their clothes, so you might just meet clothing and flesh. Some people, taking extra precautions, particularly in a tournament setting, would wear mail, so aka chainmail, brays or brayettes, they're sometimes known as, essentially like imagine boxer shorts made of chainmail. Okay, so sometimes they'd have those in there, but very often, I'd say usually, they didn't. And you'll also notice, as was common with Italian armours, these figures both have exposed backs of thighs. So they have fully enclosed lower legs, but they have open back of legs. The reason is because that armour is predominantly designed to be worn on a horse. If we look at English and some French armours, and indeed some Italian and other armours, they have fully enclosed cuisses at the top, so that there's plate all the way around the leg. The disadvantage of that is it means more weight, more heat retention, but also, most importantly, it means that you can't feel the horse's movements and control the horse quite so well. So fully enclosed upper legs, better for fighting on foot, better for fighting in a tournament, probably not so good in general for war use and campaigning. So they were exposed at the back of the legs. There are some other openings which are maybe less obvious as well. There's the back of the knees, obviously related to the back of the thighs, and the back of the knees are very difficult to protect in general. We've also got the feet. In this case, they've only got shoes on their feet. There are no sabatons, there are no plates on the feet, and we'll come back to that in future examples. Very often the feet were left uncovered. And there are obviously openings in the gauntlet. Not only do you have an opening of leather in the palm of the gauntlet, if you can get to it, and we see that in certain treatises where you actually stab into the person's palm, and indeed the cuff, into the back of the cuff of the gauntlet. And the other one is the inside of the elbow, though there's usually mail in there, although not always, as we might see in later examples. So essentially, when we're looking at a fully plated figure like this, the faces are often exposed, the feet are often relatively exposed, and then there's all the typical gaps you get with a plate harness: the armpits, the inside of the elbows, the back of the gauntlets, inside of the gauntlets, up the fold into the crotch, back of the knees, back of the legs, this kind of thing. Now what we see with this second example, which is Italian and dates to about 1490, maybe late 1480s, 1490, we actually see a contrast because we've got two figures who are essentially fully plate harnessed, and then one figure, despite the fact he's got a poleaxe, who isn't. He's essentially a lightly armoured guy. Okay, now there's a contrast there. So obviously the plated guys we've kind of talked about already. You've got the armpits, you've got the crotch, you've got the back of the legs, and notice particularly the figure on the left here, while he has mail everywhere in a long mail skirt in the typical Italian fashion of this time, he does nevertheless, if you look at the back of the legs, have no, I don't think, maybe that's mail, but it could simply be clothing. And very often we see purely the hose, or the trousers essentially, the cloth at the back of the leg. So very often the back of the leg, back of the thigh, and up to the button into the crotch is only covered by clothing. So that is a favourite target. And also notice they don't necessarily wear armour on their feet. Now if we look at the figure in the middle, again, this is an armoured person. So for most purposes, if you're fighting against this person, the fact that he's got armour on would dictate how you fight him. But he doesn't have the same type of armour as the figures either side of him. He has a brigandine on his body, like the one I showed. I'm not going to pick it up again because it's a nuisance, but it's made of many, many small steel plates with the rivets showing on the outside. Brigandine is very, very good defence, but probably not quite as good against things like crossbow bolts or lances, perhaps heavy pole arms, as a solid cuirass or breastplate is. Now on his arms, he's mostly only got mail. Not only that, but I think the mail comes down and actually stops around his elbow height, and he actually only has material, so cloth armour. Don't underestimate cloth armour though. Layers and layers of linen can be very, very effective. But he's got cloth armour basically underneath that mail. So his arms are sort of more vulnerable than obviously the guy with full plate harness on his arms. He's wearing gauntlets on his hands, which is great, good protection of his hands, but now look down to his legs. You'll notice that his shins, or his lower legs, are covered by enclosed greaves. And it's interesting because he's wearing them without the armour that goes above. So he doesn't have pollaines on his knees, he doesn't have cuisses on his thighs, so his legs are very vulnerable, and of course his face is vulnerable as well. In fact, none of these people have got helmets on because they're not actually in the act of fighting, so we can't really make an awful lot of judgment about their face or head protection. But nevertheless, to point out, many infantrymen would be armoured like this guy in the middle. Some people also might argue that he is in the process of perhaps putting more armour on. Maybe he hasn't donned all of his armour, maybe he has pollaines and cuisses which should be worn with this, quite possibly. But in other art, we do, and you can just about see some figures in the background there, we do see people who only have lower leg armour, or sometimes no leg armour. We'll see some examples of that a little bit later on. So clearly there's lots of different levels of armour in this period, and if you're fighting the armoured guy on the left or the right versus the armoured guy in the middle, it would be a very different story about how you'd be able to wound them and take them out of the fight. Now this third example is Swiss, and it dates to the 1480s, I believe. And here again we see a contrast because we see a leader figure who's essentially in full plate harness, although minus his gauntlets. There's a lot of debate about this. Does that mean that literally there were people going around with full plate harness without gauntlets on? Possibly, sometimes, or maybe it's just an artistic thing, or maybe it's because they're not actually fighting at the moment. The gauntlets would be the last thing you put on. I think that's probably most likely, and we sometimes see gauntlets hung at the belt or hung off other things. But he's essentially a fully plated figure. So everything we've said before about how to overcome a fully armoured plated figure goes for this guy at the front. But look at most of the men standing behind him. That's his retinue. We see people with various types of polearm. Very often in other art we'd see people with missile weapons, be it guns, crossbows, bows, who would be similarly equipped to this. So many of these people have sallets, hats on, okay, so they've got helmets, they've got basic head protection, probably the most important thing to wear, and many of them have breast protection. Now interestingly, this is Swiss, and in the Holy Roman Empire and Switzerland as well, so Germany, Austria, Switzerland, we often find that sort of lightly equipped infantry often wear breastplates rather than brigandines. So brigandines are something that are more common in France, England and Italy and Spain. And if we go to the east, we more often find breastplates being made. It probably for economic reasons. There was an industry building brigandines in France and Flanders and so on. There was an industry making plate armour in Germany, so maybe it was just more economically viable, I would guess. But these people have essentially got, a lot of them, although they're lowly kind of footmen, essentially, they're infantry, and they've got spears and pikes, essentially. They've got a helmet and they've got a breastplate. Very often they wouldn't have a back plate, so they'd only have a breastplate and a fold, that's the bit protecting their crotch, on the front of their body. And then the rest of their body, for most of them, has nothing else. They've got exposed faces, they've got just, their arms have just got the doublet sleeves sticking out, and the legs have just got the hose or trousers sticking out. No protection on their feet, no protection for their crotch, or protection for their hands for the most part either. So these people have protected their vitals, essentially. They put helmets on their heads, most of their important internal organs protected on the fronts of their torsos, and the rest of them is completely exposed. So again, we see a contrast here between fully armoured, be very, very different fighting that person, and semi-armoured, should we say. I won't say unarmoured, because of course they're not unarmoured, but they've got very good armour on specific bits of their body. So here we have a work of art which is Flemish, but showing English soldiers wearing the Cross of St. George, dating to probably the 1470s, I think. And this is very, very interesting for a number of reasons, but partly because it shows a mid-level of armour. So we do in fact see someone in the background who's basically fully armoured, except for the legs. Now that's interesting. That's something actually we see in a surprising amount of art, is people putting all of their armour on their top half and nothing on their legs at all. Why would a person do that? Well, mobility, comfort, but perhaps because they're expecting to fight in a landscape, could be marshy, could be swampy, slippery, whatever, where they want the full use of their legs, or indeed, they don't see the need in putting armour on their legs because they might be fighting in such massed ranks that nothing is going to be able to get down to their legs. If you imagine all standing in a massive crowd, all pushed together, there's references to a football not being able to hit the ground if you threw it on top of the crowd, because they're also squished in. So really, you're protecting the top half of your body. You don't need to worry about your legs. And in fact, having better mobility and dexterity of your legs might be a protection in itself. But now if we look at most of the other soldiers, you can see there's a number of longbowmen there, and one person at the front with a sword who may or may not also be a longbowman. You can see that they essentially have layers of armour, so they've got a fabric, probably linen armour, something like a jack, so several layers of linen stitched tightly together, with a mail shirt over the top, with, I would say, either a small cuirass or a brigandine over the top of that, and then they have a livery coat, which is the thing with the St. George cross on it over the top of that. And they've got helmets, they've all got helmets with added rondels on, which is a nice detail we see quite a lot in Flemish art. So they've got layers of armour, but again, they've got nothing on their legs. So similar theme to before, these are archers, so they want to be mobile. They're probably, many of them wouldn't necessarily have horses, but even if they do have horses, being able to get on and off a horse quickly and have greater mobility. Advantageous not having leg armour, but if you're marching on foot, certainly advantageous not having leg armour, because leg armour is going to chafe and start to become uncomfortable if you're marching for dozens of miles. But the fact is they've protected the top halves of their body in what I would call professional levels of armour, which indeed we might expect of good retinue archers during the later phases of the 100 Years' War and into the Wars of the Roses. So pretty well armoured, but where if you're fighting them, you've got to remember. Now, a lot of people, I think, when they train use of weapons, train in an unarmoured context. And I'll tell you from bitter experience, when you start fighting and your reflex is to come with a cut at the head and the person's wearing a helmet, it's a complete wasted move. You've lost your opportunity there. So you have to remember to cut at or thrust at or otherwise offend the areas that are not protected. So for everyone in this particular image, it's essentially the legs. The legs are highly vulnerable in a one-on-one situation unless they're squished together with other people. The forearms, okay, so the hands and forearms are going to be relatively vulnerable on these people. And again, the faces, particularly with thrusts, but potentially also with cuts and potentially necks as well. So legs, some parts of the arms, and faces are going to be your best targets in fighting these opponents. So this example is French from the 1480s, I believe. I think it's from Froissart's Chronicles and one of the versions. And this is very similar to the previous example. So I won't say an awful lot about it other than to just again illustrate. Here we've got people who are mixed levels of armour. Some people have got full armour. If we look at the guy on the horse towards the rear with the red brigandine looking thing on, he's fully armoured from head to foot, but he still has an open face, okay, for all of the practical reasons we've mentioned. But he is being attacked by someone with a dagger who seems to have pretty much full protection, but they have an open face with their visor up and they don't have armour on their arms. So they've elected to have armour on their legs, but not their arms. And in fact, if we look over to the right-hand side of the picture, we see another figure who, again, he has a red brigandine, he's got fully armoured legs, fully encased legs, but completely just normal clothes with a doublet with puffy shoulders, which were quite popular at this time, completely exposed arms, essentially, and face. So there's plenty there that you could target, but remember when you're fighting this person, they're going to be pretty impervious to cuts and thrusts from most hand weapons on the torso and on the legs, except for at the back of the thighs. And really the vulnerable parts are face and arms. Now, if you fight the person on the left-hand side there, who's trying to pull someone off a horse, you'll notice he has an armoured head, armoured torso, armoured arms, but he has exposed legs. So it's almost a complete swap around, different targets there. So they're both semi-armoured, but they're armoured in different ways. This makes it quite difficult to switch from opponent to opponent. You've just fought one person, you turn around and fight another person, you hit them in the arm, that person's got armour on their arms. So different opponents. And then if we look at the person more or less in the middle with yellow sleeves, they have got essentially only body and head protection. So they're only clothed on the legs, clothed on the arms, they've got no gauntlets on their hands, but they do seem to have something on their torso. It's difficult to tell from this angle, probably a brigandine, but it might even just be a livery coat, and a helmet on their head. So all different levels of armour. So these are armoured people, and the way that you would fight them and the way you would defeat them and incapacitate them are quite different in some cases. So here's an example from Germany from the 1480s, or about 1480, and this person's just essentially standing on parade with his jousting helmet and his heraldry and everything else. But I picked it as a nice example because it clearly shows someone who is wearing full plate harness, but he does not have a bever. So therefore he has an exposed face and to some degree an exposed throat down to where the male standard goes. But most importantly, and the reason why I particularly picked it out, is look at the red. He has red on his inner thighs and back of knees. These are typical openings for a German knight of this era, okay? German armours and very often Italian armours, and armours from other places in many cases as well, are exposed at the back of the thigh and the back of the knee. So this is a major target. There's big arteries there, big muscles, a major target to aim for. Also, look at the other red, look down at the feet. He does not wear sabatons. Admittedly, they could be shoes with some kind of sort of inbuilt armour in them, but let's just assume they're shoes. The feet are therefore vulnerable. And again, we see targeting of feet in the treatises. It's mentioned explicitly several times in the anonymous Bolognese source for Poleaxe combat, telling you to stab at the person's foot. And finally, one that I think a lot of people don't necessarily think about is these are German gauntlets that the cuff of the gauntlet does not go all the way around on the inside. So he has an exposed inside of wrist. This is a major target, and we see this done again in treatises. So even with a fully enclosed cuff on a gauntlet, you can stab in the back of it around any side of the cuff. But with a sort of Gothic style German gauntlet, you can actually stab straight into the inside of the wrist. And of course, the palms. The palms are only ever covered with leather, so you can stab into there as well. So there are various places on this opponent, despite the fact he's going to be very tough and very difficult to fight, and he's wearing very good looking armour that's probably going to protect him very, very well. He still has openings that you can particularly stab into and in some cases cut into. Now this is a German example from 1475, and I really just pulled it off because it's a good example of removing armour. Okay, so something you have to bear in mind is no matter how good someone's armour is, removing their armour or compromising their armour is a factor of combat as well. And in this case, we've explicitly seen a helmet pulled off someone, and so he can be chopped in the neck. I think he's being beheaded in this. So despite the fact there are openings in armour, when you're fighting someone in armour, by hitting or aiming for the points or the straps or getting into wrestling, and as we see in Paulus Karl, or is it Das Solitern, I can't remember, cutting the straps of the pauldron with the knife, with the rondel dagger, to expose the shoulder. There are ways that you can create openings by compromising the armour that's worn. So this is from a French manuscript of between 1460 and 1480, and this is again just a good example of the fact that not everyone wears all the armour. So we've got two people here at the foreground. One is essentially in full plate harness but a brigandine on the body but with an open face. So you now know all the openings you can go for. Notice also that he doesn't have gauntlets. None of the people here in this scene have gauntlets on. So his hands are vulnerable, his face is vulnerable, particularly so, and then there's all the other openings you normally have in armoured fighting: the crotch, the back of the knees, the inside of the elbow, this kind of thing. But the figure on the right has fully armoured legs, has on his torso a placard with either a covered breastplate or perhaps a brigandine, difficult to know, with a mail shirt underneath. But notice, exposed face, exposed hands, the arms are only covered by mail. Now, not to say that mail is useless. Mail was worn for hundreds of years as a very effective armour, so it will protect usually against cuts and thrusts in most situations. But it's not as protective as plate armour harness is. That's why people invented plate arm harness. So a heavy blow from a poleaxe is still going to break your arm, or a really good thrust with a spear, or in some cases a sword or a dagger, will puncture through mail, and an arrow as well. So the arms on him, despite the fact they are armoured, he has made a compromise. He wants full mobility of the arms, maybe because he's a sword and buckler fencer, but he wants full mobility of the arms, but he's sacrificed some of that protection. Now this is an absolutely wonderful scene from a French manuscript of around 1480, and here we see a variety of armours. I'm not going to go into detail, but feast your eyes on that lovely scene. So much detail to look at there. We can see an archer there who doesn't really have any armour except for a mail shirt and a placard. Maybe that's a placard with a covered breastplate. It's difficult to tell, but essentially their arms and their legs completely just fabric covered with clothing. They only have a hat on their head as well. They don't even have a helmet, and they have an exposed face as well. So they're a ripe target in hand-to-hand combat, I would say. But then if we look at some of the other figures, if you see the guy with the sword and buckler, he appears to have pretty comprehensive plate armour. Fully plated arms, he's got a sallet. We can't actually see his legs, but the person in front of him, bent over holding a glaive in a green, has essentially full plate harness, head to foot with a sallet. Probably not got a bever, just a male standard, but nevertheless essentially a fully plated figure. And so we see a mixture. We see everything from not unarmoured. Even here, the least armoured person is probably that archer or maybe the crossbowman on the left. And whilst they have uncovered arms and legs, they do have torso armour and head armour. Or the archer doesn't, but the crossbowman has head armour as well. So the longbowman, or the archer here, is probably the least armoured person, but they still have armour. And a final example we're going to look at here is a person who has a very well armoured head and neck and throat. It's a strange image in a way, and that's why I've thrown it in here. So they've got a sallet with the visor up, they've got a bever, they've put their bever on. It has a full collar that goes all around the back, which is actually fairly unusual. And they have their mail underpants on. You'll notice they've got their tighty whities in chainmail, so they've got a fantastically protected crotch and butt. But their legs are completely uncovered, and their torso appears to be uncovered, and their arms have what could be loosely called jack chains, which is something that I'll probably do a dedicated video about in the future, which are essentially little plates or sometimes chains, rings, put down the outside of the arm, often with a larger one at the elbow, you'll see there, protect the side or back of the elbow. And you also find these on legs sometimes. So you sometimes find similar armour put on the outside of a person's clothing on the legs. So this is kind of really weird. It's like minimal armour on the arms, no armour on the legs that we can see, except for the butt and the crotch. So I don't really know what to make of this. I think this is probably artistic license. So there's some random bits of armour thrown together, and we have to bear in mind artistic license is also a factor with all medieval and Renaissance art. And just before I conclude, I wanted you to just see this image as well, because I thought it was quite nice that overall, unlike some of the heroic images of people cleaving through armour that we see in medieval, particularly biblical and mythological and legendary scenes in medieval manuscripts, this is a little bit more literal, because it's got a whole bunch of people wearing mostly fully armoured and a couple of them wearing less armour. And for the most part, the wounds that are shown are to unarmoured places. So if we notice the guy that's bent over in the middle, holding a sword up by his head, wearing yellow, he has a chop through his torso, but he's just wearing clothes. So whilst the guys left and right of him are wearing full armour, he's only got a doublet with a coat over the top of it, livery coat, and he's been chopped through, as you would, because if you've got a sharp sword and you chop someone who's just wearing clothes, it will chop into them. That's why armour's worn. And then if we look at the guy down at the foreground at the front, who's dead, basically lying back looking up at the sky, he has got a cut neck. So despite the fact that he's fully armoured, and we can presume he had a helmet on at some point, I think it's fallen off, he's cut in the neck because these people are fighting with exposed faces again. Despite the fact they've got head to foot armour, they've elected to have their faces and in some cases their necks exposed for greater breathing and convenience, visibility, everything else. So the vulnerable part is the face. So this is a nice example of where we see, there's one example of a glaive chopping into the back of a helmet, has to be said, but by and large, this shows wounds on either unarmoured people or an unarmoured gap on an armoured person. So I hope that's given you something to think about. This is a fascinating topic. Obviously there's hundreds and hundreds of manuscript images I could plough through, and there's some really bizarre examples, but I wanted to give you a little taster for using medieval art. What can we tell about the different levels of medieval armour worn at the time, and how this would affect how you fight someone, and what the target areas are, and what, just hitting someone on the helmet with your sword will probably do nothing, but if you just aim a little bit lower and catch them in the neck or thrust them in the face, then they'll be dead. So sometimes small differences in the choice of technique or exactly what you do in that fight can have very, very differing results, because obviously armour can't be everywhere, it can't encase everything, but what it does encase, it works very, very effectively at protecting. But remember, even the most fully armoured person still has gaps, and most people in war, as far as we can tell from medieval source material, artistic or written, left more gaps than was necessarily ideal. Very often they had open faces, very often they had exposed back of the legs, and then there's all the typical exposures at the gaps, at the articulations where you can't really put plate, and very often people didn't even bother wearing mail there either. Very often in art we see fabric at the inside of the elbow, we see fabric at the back of the knee, there's no sign of there being any mail there. Hope this has been interesting. Give us a like and a subscribe, and I'll see you back on the channel really, really soon. Cheers, folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.